One constant question about Thomas Piketty's phenomenal book is what influence it will have on the intellectual temper of the debate in the United States. The short-term impact was really quite dramatic, but the long-term impact, I think, will be much less. The book is riddled with so many controversial misjunctions and factual difficulties that in the end, I don't think that it will prove persuasive. It turns out that wealth cannot increase at an indefinite rate relative to income. It turns out that capital markets are extremely complex and that much labor becomes capital, and that its systems of taxation are so onerous and so difficult to administer that people will not sit put for seeing that thing put into place. So I think it's going to be a boomlet. It's certainly not the next Wealth of Nations. One of the real difficulties of dealing with somebody like Piketty is that he treats inequality as the dominant value. But for most people, two things matter. One is, how did it come about? That is, was it the result of honest labor or was it the result of crony capitalism? He doesn't distinguish between those two things, and most people do. And secondly, there's the deep conceptual puzzle, which says that if I make myself better off without making you worse off, why is it that when the increased gap takes place, that somehow that we should be upset about it? Generally speaking, if somebody is wealthier, he improves the opportunities for other individuals. It's not as though, as I get richer and perhaps healthier, that you get poorer and sicker. One of the things that drives the Piketty Express in the United States is the real unease about the decline of average and median income in this country. By the time it's 2014, incomes at the median level have slipped back to roughly what they were in 1996. And so people see themselves going backwards. It's the actual and absolute decline in wealth that creates an enormous amount of apprehension. The question is what to do about it. The last thing to do about it is to tax the capital that would create the wealth that's needed for the jobs. What you really have to do is to look much more at microeconomics and see the incredible way in which the systems of regulation and taxation have impaired labor markets. And by this standard, the efforts to create, quote, living wages of $10 per hour minimum wage or $15 per minimum wage are absolutely destructive. Some people will get higher wages, but many people will find themselves without jobs. They will be put on welfare. That will kill their development of their own human capital and will tax the capital of everybody else, so that these devices, which are designed to redress inequality, turn out to be Pareto pessimal, meaning they turn out to leave everybody worse off once you understand the responses that private individuals give to the legal restraints that are now imposed by legislation. One of the questions is, can we do anything in the long run through education? And the answer is we sure can. The United States has two marvelous movements going on now. One of them has to do with fracking and the way in which you could deal with the energy crisis, and the other has to do with charter schools and the way in which you could deal with education. My youngest child, Elliot, in fact, works at the Success Academy in New York, and he is in charge of trying to hire enough people to put together 12 new schools in the next year or so. And what happens is, if you look at the performance of those schools, taking kids from poor minority backgrounds, they outperform kids in suburban schools. They have teachers who are dedicated, they're not encumbered by union work rules, and they do long hours, and the expectations is that there are no students at the Success Academy, there are only scholars. It's literally the way in which they describe it. And what one has to do is to see if you could systematically empty out the public schools by allowing more and more charters to form. And the public school system, if it wants to survive, is then have to go into competition with these private schools, and they'll get better. It will take a few years to do this, but if parents know that their children have a future brighter than their own, it will do an enormous amount to quiet political discontent. It's very hard to find the kind of manifesto on this side of the aisle which is equivalent to the Piketty book and so forth. If you go back and you want popular treatments, I think Capitalism and Freedom, which Milton Friedman wrote some 50-odd years ago, is still a pretty good statement of how it is that voluntary markets manage to provide improvements across the board. Yesterday I spoke at the Center for Policy Studies, and when you listen to the clips of Margaret Thatcher when she was young and in the education mission, What you saw in conservatism was not a protection of the privileged. It was an effort to try and open up the benefits of markets for everybody else. And I think the kind of very harsh denunciation that she receives from her critics simply is inconsistent with the sort of universalistic aspirations that she displayed in her years in politics.